Washington's Fabian deception, how a farmer's general turned British arrogance into America's greatest advantage. But here's what most people get wrong about this story, and here is what I'm going to reveal to you by the end of this video. Washington's genius was not that he defeated the British through clever evasion. His real power was something far darker, far more calculated, and far more dangerous to his own men than anyone wants to admit. He deliberately turned American sacrifice into psychological warfare. Stay with me, because at the end of this investigation, you will understand why Washington's greatest victory was not won on any battlefield. It was won by making an empire doubt its own invincibility. And that secret? It came at a price that history has spent 250 years trying to forget. If you're watching this channel, you already know that freedom demands sacrifice. But what you might not know is this. George Washington understood something about sacrifice that made him fundamentally different from every other general of his era. He did not see suffering as something to minimize. He saw it as a weapon. Before we continue, I need to tell you something important. The complete mechanisms behind Washington's psychological strategy, the actual signals, the hidden communications, the deliberate moves that broke British confidence, all of that is covered in exhaustive depth in our premium guide, which you can find linked in the description and in the pinned comment below. This is not a free resource. It is a deep dive into the archival evidence, the intercepted letters, and the strategic reasoning that Washington never publicly revealed. But if you want to truly understand how a farmer's general outmaneuvered the world's most dominant empire, that guide is where the real story lives. Now subscribe to this channel, and I genuinely mean this, because what we cover here is the uncommon history, the parts they left out of the textbooks. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever realized that the person you thought was your greatest weakness was actually your greatest teacher? That question matters to what comes next. Wait, this part is important. Everything I am about to tell you depends on understanding one thing that most American history classes completely skip over. The British did not go to war against the American colonies to simply crush them militarily. That would have been easy. Britain sent its army across the Atlantic with a specific assumption that overwhelming professional force would break colonial resistance in a matter of months, maybe a year. The colonies would collapse under the weight of organized military superiority. And then something unexpected happened. A farmer with no formal military education refused to fight the way the British expected him to fight. George Washington was born in Westmoreland County, Virginia, in 1732. His family was not aristocracy. His father was a planter and surveyor, a man who worked the land, understood property boundaries, understood the shape and texture of terrain the way only someone who has walked it for decades can understand it. Young George followed that same path. By his mid-20s, he was one of Virginia's most respected surveyors and militia officers. He had seen combat against the French and their Native American allies in the Monongahela Valley. Brutal, chaotic, nothing like the disciplined formations of European warfare. And he had tasted failure there. That early military failure, that humiliation at Monongahela, shaped him in ways that the British commanders who arrived in 1776 could never have anticipated. Because when the Continental Congress handed him the title of Commander-in-Chief, Washington did not attempt to build a European army. He could have. He had studied military theory. He knew what a proper standing force looked like. Instead, he did something that contradicted every principle of military orthodoxy that the British lived by. He built an army designed specifically to lose battles while winning a war. Think about that for a moment. Washington inherited a force that was poorly trained, badly equipped, chronically underfunded, and composed largely of men who saw military service as a temporary obligation between harvest seasons. Most generals would have seen this as an impossible position. Washington saw it as a tactical advantage that nobody else could recognize. The logic was inverted, but it was sound. He could not defeat the British Empire in a war of attrition. Britain had resources, depth of supply, endless reinforcements. But Britain also had something that became its fatal vulnerability, an absolute conviction in its own superiority. And that conviction was not based on flexibility. It was based on the assumption that any conflict with colonial militia would follow a specific, predictable pattern. Britain had been fighting this way for 100 years. Its officers had studied at the same academies, learned the same tactics, rehearsed the same maneuvers. The American colonies represented not a new kind of enemy, but simply a new version of the same old enemy, rebels with outdated methods who would eventually collapse under organized military pressure. Washington's first major test came in August of 1776 on Long Island. The Continental Army had roughly 10,000 men defending Brooklyn Heights. General William Howe, the British commander, had over 30,000 troops, professional soldiers, seasoned officers, superior artillery, complete naval support. The battle itself was a rout. American forces were outflanked on multiple fronts. Howe's tactics were, by the standards of European warfare, flawlessly executed. The Americans should have been trapped against the East River and annihilated that single afternoon. And something unexpected happened. A thick fog rolled in after sunset. Washington, showing tactical brilliance that his critics rarely give him credit for, organized what military historians call a silent evacuation. Using every boat he could commandeer, fishing boats, merchant vessels, rowboats, anything that could float, he ferried approximately 9,000 soldiers, along with their horses, their cannons, and their supplies, across the East River to Manhattan. The entire operation took roughly 9 hours. British sentries were posted less than 600 yards away from the embarkation point. They heard nothing. By dawn, when the fog lifted and Howe realized what had occurred, the American army had vanished. That retreat saved the revolution. But more importantly, it taught Washington a lesson that would define his entire approach to the war. He could not defeat the British in a frontal assault. Not on an open field with formed ranks and bayonet charges. Not with these soldiers, not with this equipment, not with this level of organization. So he made a decision that seemed like defeat but was actually strategy. He stopped fighting the war the British expected him to fight. Instead, he fought the war that would break the British mind. This is where the story most people tell stops. They talk about Washington's victories, his moments of brilliance, his eventual triumph, but they skip over the part that reveals his true genius. Because what Washington did after Long Island was not retreat in shame, it was the initiation of a strategy so psychologically sophisticated that it would eventually hollow out British confidence from the inside. Human historians call it the Fabian strategy, named after the Roman general Fabius Maximus, who wore down Hannibal's army not by fighting it directly, but by refusing direct engagement and systematically destroying his supply lines and supply networks. But that name misses what Washington actually accomplished. Fabius was trying to avoid losing. Washington was deliberately constructing a scenario where the British could never win, not militarily, but psychologically. Because every time Washington chose to retreat instead of fight, every time he sacrificed terrain and territory, every time he chose to preserve his army instead of defending a city, he was sending a message to British command that corroded their certainty. That message was this: I am not afraid of you. And more importantly, I do not need to defeat you militarily. I only need to outlast you. I only need to make you question whether the cost of winning this war is worth paying. And that realization, that dawning horror in British command that they might be fighting a war they could not win, was the real battlefield. It was invisible. It left no blood. It made no sound. But it was where America's independence was truly decided. Not. End of part 1. But understanding that Washington had committed to a strategy of attrition, of patience, of refusal, was one thing. Actually executing it while your soldiers were starving, while your generals were screaming for action, while Congress was threatening to replace you, was something entirely different. This was where Washington's true genius revealed itself. He had to make the British believe he was weaker than he actually was. He had to make them think every engagement was a genuine military disaster for the Americans, when in reality, he was orchestrating a slow, methodical dismantling of their will to continue. The retreat from New York in the autumn of 1776 was the beginning of this dance. After the disaster at Long Island, Washington's army was reduced to perhaps 3,000 effective soldiers. The British had roughly 25,000 under arms in and around New York City. On paper, it should have taken Howe and his commanders perhaps 3 weeks to hunt down and destroy Washington's remaining force. Instead, what followed was a chase that lasted months and covered hundreds of miles through New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. Washington never stood and fought when he was outnumbered. He never allowed the British to dictate the terms of engagement. Every time Howe moved to trap him, Washington was already gone. His soldiers called it the Long Retreat, and it nearly broke them. Food was scarce. Winter was coming. Morale was collapsing. Enlistments were expiring. Washington watched men desert almost daily because they had families to feed and homes to return to. He had no way to stop them. He had no pay to offer them. He had almost nothing except the force of his own will and the clarity of his vision. He wrote to Congress that the army was on the verge of dissolution, that without reinforcements or supplies, the cause would be lost within weeks. Congress, sitting in Philadelphia with no real understanding of conditions on the ground, debated endlessly and sent almost nothing. And yet, this was the crucial part, Washington never broke his strategy. He never allowed desperation to force him into a decisive battle he could not win. He kept retreating, he kept the army intact, he moved through New Jersey, across the Delaware, into Pennsylvania. The British and their Hessian allies pursued, but always a few hours too late, always finding an empty campsite where the Americans had been, always discovering that their prey had crossed another river, burned another bridge, disappeared into another forest. By December 1776, the British believed they had cornered Washington for good. His army had dwindled to perhaps 2,000 soldiers. Howe decided to establish winter quarters, spreading his forces across New Jersey in a series of cantonments, fortified towns where his men could rest, resupply, and wait for spring. He left garrisons of Hessian mercenaries in places like Trenton, Princeton, and Bordentown. These men had fought across Europe. They were professionals. They understood warfare. What they did not understand was that everything they were seeing, the weakness, the desperation, the collapse of the American cause, was exactly what Washington wanted them to see. This is where that Christmas night crossing comes into focus. But the real story is not the famous battle that followed. The real story is what Washington did between December 26th and January 3rd. In those 8 days, he won 3 separate battles. He defeated the Hessians at Trenton. He then turned north and, when British reinforcements moved to trap him, he slipped around them in the night and attacked the British garrison at Princeton. Then he moved south again to Elizabethtown. 3 victories, 3 different locations. 3 times he had caught his enemies in positions where their numbers and their discipline meant nothing because Washington had dictated the time, the place, and the terms of each engagement. But here is the part that most people miss, and it is absolutely critical to understanding why this strategy worked when conventional wisdom said it should fail. After these victories, Washington did not try to hold the towns he had liberated. He did not dig in. He did not declare victory. He withdrew again. He pulled his army back into the hills and the forests of northern New Jersey and the highlands of New York. The British were shocked. They had expected him to try to expand his victories, to rally the population, to seize momentum. Instead, he simply vanished again. Wait, this part is important, and I want you to understand it fully. What Washington was doing was something that most military commanders, even today, struggle to comprehend. He was using victory not as an end in itself, but as a tool to accomplish something far larger than winning a single battle or taking a single town. He was systematically destroying the British narrative of military superiority. He was proving that when the fight was on his terms, the Americans could win. He was teaching his own soldiers that they were capable of defeating British regulars, and he was beginning to make the British command question whether they truly understood what they were fighting. Before we continue, I need to make sure you have the complete picture of how this strategy actually unfolded. The patterns, the signals, the mechanisms behind Washington's approach, all of these are explained in extraordinary depth in the comprehensive guide that we have created for this channel. It is available in the description and pinned in the comments below. In that guide, you will find detailed analysis of every major engagement, the logistical realities Washington faced, the political pressures he was under, and the specific tactical innovations he introduced. If you want to understand not just what happened, but why it happened, and how similar principles have shaped other pivotal moments in military history, that ebook is essential reading. It goes far deeper than we can in a video format, and it is linked below. Now, back to the core question that was gnawing at British command as they sat in their winter quarters in early 1777. How do you defeat an army that refuses to fight you in the way you expect? How do you use your advantages, your numbers, your training, your discipline, your supplies, against an enemy that will not stand still and accept a conventional battle? Howe was a competent commander, but he was operating within the conventional military thinking of his era. He believed that wars were won by controlling territory and defeating enemy armies in decisive battles. Washington was fighting a different kind of war entirely. What Howe failed to grasp, and what most of his peers did not grasp either, was that Washington was fighting not just to win battles, but to win a war of attrition against an enemy that could not sustain the cost of an indefinite conflict. The British had to ship supplies across the Atlantic. Every soldier who was killed or wounded had to be replaced by recruiting new men or hiring more mercenaries. Every year of war cost millions of pounds. The American soldiers were fighting for their homes, their families, their future independence. Yes, many of them were hungry, tired, and desperate. But they were not paying for the war. They were not sending their resources across an ocean. They were fighting on their own soil with their own supply lines measured in miles, not thousands of miles. This was the invisible advantage that no British general could solve with cavalry charges or disciplined formations. And Washington understood it from the very beginning. He had seen the French and Indian War. He knew how supply lines could break. He knew how an army far from home could become increasingly vulnerable the longer a war dragged on. He was betting everything, his life, his reputation, the future of the nation, on the idea that British patience would break before American resolve did. By the spring of 1777, Washington had accomplished something remarkable. His army was still intact. His cause was still alive. He had proven that the Americans could fight effectively when given the chance. And perhaps most importantly, he had shifted the entire nature of the conflict. The British were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to avoid losing. They were no longer confident of rapid victory. They were beginning to wonder if victory was even possible. That realization, that horror spreading through British command that they might actually lose this war, was the true turning point of the American Revolution. Not because Washington had crushed them in battle, not because he had captured New York or held Philadelphia, but because he had made them question everything they believed about warfare, about victory, and about the cost of empire. He had taken a ragged collection of farmers and shopkeepers and turned them into soldiers who believed they could win. He had taken a desperate, nearly impossible situation and transformed it into something that looked almost possible. And in doing that, in making the British understand that they might be paying a price they could no longer afford, Washington had done something that no amount of conventional military victory could have accomplished. He had given America something more powerful than an army. He had given it hope. And in a revolution, hope is sometimes more valuable than all the cannons and soldiers and supplies in the world. But Washington understood something his officers sometimes did not. Hope alone wins no wars. What he had accomplished in those months of constant movement, those forced marches through snow and mud, those narrow escapes and calculated retreats, was something far more practical. He had begun to understand the British mind itself, and more importantly, he had learned how to exploit it. General William Howe was not a stupid man. He was methodical, experienced, and commanding what was then the most professional fighting force on Earth. But he operated under an assumption that would eventually become his greatest weakness. He believed that wars were won by controlling territory, by holding cities, by occupying ground, by breaking the enemy army in pitched battle. This was the conventional wisdom of European warfare. It had worked for 100 years. It had never faced an opponent willing to simply walk away. Every city Washington abandoned, Howe claimed as a victory. Every retreat became, in Howe's dispatches back to London, evidence that the Continental Army was collapsing, and London believed it. Lord George Germain, the Secretary of State for America, read these reports and assured Parliament that the rebellion was in its death throes. The campaign of 1777 would be the final push. One more coordinated strike, one more massive show of force, and it would all be over. That confidence was about to meet something it had never encountered before. Brittany generals had defeated the French in North America. They had conquered Canada. They had never faced an enemy that did not think like them, did not fight like them, and refused to behave according to the rules of warfare that had governed European conflicts for generations. Before we continue, and I need you to pay close attention to what comes next, because this is where Washington's strategy shifts into something genuinely brilliant. You need to understand the full depth of his thinking. The patterns he was following, the calculations he was making in real time, the way he was reading his enemy's psychology like a book written in their own language, that level of detail, that granular understanding of how and why the British mind worked the way it did, all of that is exactly what our complete strategy guide covers in depth. You'll find it in the description and pinned in the comments. It breaks down not just what Washington did, but how you can recognize these same patterns of deceptive strategy in history, in business, even in negotiation. And if you want to go deeper than what any single video can show you, that guide is where the real keys are waiting. In the spring of 1777, British High Command in New York began executing what they believed would be the final destruction of Washington's army. General John Burgoyne, commanding forces from Canada, was ordered to push south down the Hudson River Valley. His objective was to link up with Howe's forces coming north from New York City. If successful, this pincer movement would cut New England off from the southern colonies, split the rebellion in half, and force Washington into a decisive battle where British superior numbers and training would overwhelm the Americans. On paper, it was flawless, and therein lay its fatal flaw. Washington received intelligence of this plan. His scouts brought him reports of Burgoyne's movement, and instead of panicking, instead of rushing north to meet Burgoyne head-on, Washington did something almost incomprehensible to a conventional commander. He largely ignored it. He stationed a smaller force under the command of General Philip Schuyler in the Mohawk Valley to slow Burgoyne's advance. But the main body of the Continental Army remained south, under Washington's direct command, maintaining pressure on Howe's forces around New York. Why would he do this? Why would Washington refuse to respond to what looked like the decisive British offensive of the entire war? The answer reveals everything about how Washington thought. He understood that Burgoyne's offensive had a fatal assumption embedded within it. It assumed that Howe would do his part, that Howe would push north from New York to meet Burgoyne halfway. But Howe, operating under his own conviction that holding territory meant victory, was focused on capturing Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress had established its headquarters. He did not see Burgoyne's campaign as his primary objective, so when Burgoyne pushed south, he did so with the understanding that Howe would be coming north to meet him, and Howe never came. He was too busy celebrating his occupation of another American city. Burgoyne found himself pushing deeper and deeper into hostile territory, his supply lines stretching thinner with every mile, his force gradually being whittled away by American militia that seemed to emerge from the forest itself. The forest that had so intimidated British soldiers in previous conflicts became a nightmare. Every stream crossing was contested, every bridge was burned. The local population, which might have been neutral if Burgoyne had treated them with courtesy, became active enemies when his supply-hungry army began confiscating their livestock and food stores. By the time Burgoyne realized that Howe was not coming, he was already committed too far forward. Retreat was now as dangerous as advance. His only hope was to push on, break through to the Hudson River, and link up with whatever forces he could find coming north. But the forces coming north had paused at West Point, content to hold that strategic position while Burgoyne struggled in the wilderness to the north. In September of 1777, Burgoyne's army was surrounded. He had roughly 10,000 men. The American forces surrounding him, under the command of General Horatio Gates, had grown to nearly 20,000. Gates had learned from Washington's example. He did not attack Burgoyne's prepared positions directly. Instead, he simply held them in place. He closed off their line of retreat. He made every sortie costly. And he waited for hunger, exhaustion, and the weight of their own predicament to do what a frontal assault could not. Burgoyne, a man of pride and military honor, faced an impossible choice. He could continue fighting and be annihilated. He could surrender with some dignity now, or be destroyed wholesale later. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army, nearly 10,000 British and German soldiers, an entire invasion force, laid down their weapons to an American army that had no right to exist, much less defeat a British general in open combat. But here is where the story takes a turn that historians often rush past, because Burgoyne's surrender, catastrophic as it was not the real victory. The real victory was what Washington understood was happening at that exact moment, 150 miles away, in London. Burgoyne's defeat was catastrophic enough. 10,000 men, gone. But worse, far worse, was what it revealed about British strategy. The fact that Howe had not moved north meant that Burgoyne's offensive was never coordinated at all. London had assumed unity of command. In reality, the two British generals had been operating almost independently, each convinced of his own plan's superiority, and that lack of coordination had destroyed an entire invasion force. Word of Burgoyne's defeat spread through Europe with stunning speed, and in the courts of Paris and Madrid, European powers that had been watching the American rebellion with cautious interest suddenly saw something new. They saw an empire making catastrophic mistakes. They saw an army that could actually be defeated. And most importantly, they saw an opportunity. Within months of Burgoyne's surrender, France, Britain's ancient rival and the nation that had lost so much territory to Britain in previous wars, formally entered the conflict on the American side. French ships brought supplies, ammunition, and eventually French soldiers to fight alongside the Continental Army. French money flowed to finance the war effort. French diplomacy isolated Britain from potential allies, and a war that had looked like a straightforward British suppression of a minor rebellion suddenly became a global conflict that Britain could not win. And this was Washington's real genius. He had never intended to defeat the British army through military superiority. He could not. The British army was superior. But he had understood that he could win by making the war too expensive for Britain to continue fighting. Every month the war dragged on. Every supply line that had to be defended, every battle that produced wounded soldiers that had to be evacuated and treated, every city that had to be occupied and garrisoned, all of it cost money. Vast sums of money. Money that Britain was borrowing. Money that Parliament had to vote to fund. Money that British citizens were increasingly unwilling to pay. By refusing to give Howe the decisive battle that Howe wanted, Washington had forced Britain into an endless war of attrition. And Britain, with all its wealth and professional soldiers, was not actually equipped to win that kind of war. The side with superior numbers and training wins when there is a clear victor's advantage after a certain number of battles. But when the war becomes a test of endurance, of willingness to pay, of national fatigue, those advantages dissolve, and that was the game Washington was playing. This is the calculation Washington was making every single day. Not how do I win this battle, but rather, how long can Britain afford to keep fighting this war? And in making that calculation, he had discovered something that would not be fully understood in military circles for another century and a half. The only way to defeat a superior power is to refuse to fight on their terms. Every conventional victory Washington won came at a cost he could not sustain. But every time he refused to fight, every time he retreated, regrouped, and reappeared somewhere the British did not expect, he was winning a different kind of victory entirely. A victory measured not in battles captured, but in British morale depleted. A victory measured not in squares of territory held, but in the erosion of political will in London. By the time the war reached Yorktown, by the time the final decisive battle was fought in 1781, Washington had already won. He had won not by breaking the British army at its point of greatest strength, but by exhausting the British will to continue fighting. He had turned the greatest military power on earth into a nation that simply could not afford to keep paying for a war against an enemy that would not die and would not surrender and would not do them the courtesy of being defeated in a conventional manner. And that is the secret Washington knew that the British never understood. Victory in war is not always measured in the moment of surrender. Sometimes it is measured in the months and years beforehand, in every decision to retreat when attacking would have felt better, in every night march through hostile territory that kept the army alive and moving, in every calculated risk that raised the cost of continuing the war a little bit higher for the enemy. Washington had turned the British advantage, their size, their training, their resources, into a disadvantage. An empire with vast resources could not afford an endless war. A smaller force, with nothing to lose but everything to gain, could keep fighting indefinitely. And that fundamental reversal of advantage, that psychological warfare played out across 5 years and 13 states, was the real Fabian deception. This is the secret I promised you at the beginning. Washington did not win the American Revolution through superior tactics or overwhelming force. He won it by understanding something that every commander before him had missed, that the British Empire's greatest strength was also its fatal weakness. An empire fights wars at a distance. It stretches supply lines across an ocean. It tries to hold territory it does not understand, with soldiers who are tired of being away from home. And every day the war continues, costs money that even the richest nation eventually cannot sustain forever. Washington grasped this before anyone else. The Continental Congress did not have the resources to match Britain in a conventional war, so he would not fight one. Instead, he would fight the war that Britain could afford least, the endless war. The war of attrition, the war where patience itself became a weapon. Look at what he did in New Jersey after Trenton. After that victory in the snow, Washington could have pressed forward, attacked more British positions, tried to liberate as much territory as possible. That would have felt like winning. That would have looked like victory to Congress and to the soldiers. But Washington understood that every engagement risked his army. One bad battle could unravel everything. So instead, he maneuvered. He moved his forces north and south, east and west. He kept the British guessing. He kept the army intact. He made the British garrison thousands of troops just to hold the territory they had already captured, troops they could not use anywhere else, supplies they had to send from across the ocean. And this pattern repeated itself across 5 years. Valley Forge, in the winter of 1777 and 1778, Washington kept the army alive through unimaginable suffering so that it would still exist when spring came. He did not break it apart. He did not send soldiers home for the winter. He held them together through cold and starvation. Because an army that dissolves is an army that never comes back together. The British sat in their comfortable quarters in Philadelphia and Boston and New York, thinking about the cannons and uniforms and food that had to be shipped across the Atlantic to keep their soldiers supplied. Washington sat in the cold with his men, thinking about the next month, the next year, the war that would not end. Then came the Southern Campaign. After years of fighting in the North, the war shifted south. And again, Washington did something that puzzled his critics. He did not try to hold every city. He did not commit his entire army to stop Cornwallis's invasion. Instead, he sent smaller forces under commanders like Nathaniel Greene and Daniel Morgan to harass the British, to make every mile they advanced more expensive than the last, to drag them deeper into hostile territory while keeping the main Continental Army in reserve. Greene lost battle after battle in the conventional sense. But with each loss, Cornwallis lost more soldiers. With each engagement, British supply lines grew longer and more vulnerable. By the time Cornwallis reached Yorktown in September of 1781, his army was exhausted. His supplies were running low, and Washington finally had what he needed, a chance to use his Fabian strategy as a springboard for a conventional victory. He brought the main army south. He coordinated with the French Navy to trap Cornwallis by sea, and after a siege that lasted 3 weeks, Cornwallis surrendered. More than 7,000 British soldiers laid down their weapons. The war was not officially over. That would come with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. But every British officer who saw that surrender understood the truth. They could not win this war. They could not defeat an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. Washington's Fabian strategy was not a deception in the sense of hiding facts or spreading false information. It was a deception in the way that a magician deceives, by controlling what the audience sees and expects. The British expected a war where the rebels would either be crushed quickly or would tire and go home. Washington showed them a war that could go on forever. The British expected to impose their will through superior numbers and resources. Washington showed them that numbers and resources mean nothing if you cannot make your enemy capitulate. The British expected victory to come when they won the most battles. Washington showed them that victory comes when your opponent admits they cannot continue. And here is what makes this even more remarkable. Washington accomplished this while being outnumbered, outgunned, and out-resourced in almost every way that conventional military thinking would measure. His soldiers were paid less, their uniforms were worse, their training was incomplete, their weapons were often inferior, they had no navy to speak of, they had no source of supply except what they could capture or manufacture themselves. Every advantage lay with the British. And yet Washington's understanding of how empires fight, with stretched supply lines and political costs back home, allowed him to turn those advantages upside down. There is a reason military academies still study Washington's campaigns. Not because he was the most aggressive general or the most brilliant tactician in the conventional sense, but because he understood something that most military leaders have to learn through defeat. Sometimes the greatest victory is not the one you see in a single afternoon on the battlefield. Sometimes it is the victory you build over months and years by making your enemy's position more and more untenable, by making the cost of continuing the war exceed the value of winning it. That is Fabian's strategy at its heart. Washington was not a farmer playing at being a general. He was a general who understood that farming requires patience, that you cannot rush the seasons, that you cannot force a crop to grow faster than it will naturally grow, and that the farmer who survives is the one who understands the long arc of seasons, not the short moment of planting or harvest. He brought that farmer's wisdom to war. He brought the understanding that time itself could be a weapon. And when the war ended, when Washington had his army lay down their arms and return to civilian life, he did something that most victorious generals do not do. He stepped aside. He did not seize power. He did not declare himself king or dictator. He went back to Mount Vernon to farm. He understood that the revolution was not about him, it was about the idea that a people could govern themselves. The Fabian strategy won the war. But it was Washington's character that preserved the revolution and allowed it to grow into something larger than any single man, larger than any army, larger than any general's ambition. That is the real secret of Washington's Fabian deception. It was not just a military strategy. It was a lesson in how to accomplish the impossible by refusing to accept the terms of the battle itself. The British wanted a quick war. Washington offered them an endless one. The British wanted conventional victory. Washington offered them irrelevance. The British wanted to crush the revolution before it took root. And Washington kept that revolution alive long enough for something even more powerful than military strategy to take over. The belief of ordinary people that they could create their own country, that they could govern themselves, that freedom was worth the sacrifice. Here is what you need to remember from this story. The greatest advantage you can have in any struggle, whether it is military, professional, or personal, is the willingness to think long-term while your opponent thinks short-term. Washington believed in something bigger than himself. The British believed in maintaining an empire. And in the end, the man who thought beyond his own lifetime defeated the empire that could not afford to think beyond its next quarterly report to Parliament. So the next time you face an opponent or a challenge that seems overwhelming, ask yourself one question. Am I thinking about winning today, or am I thinking about winning in 5 years? Because if you can answer that question the way Washington did, you might just find that the impossible becomes inevitable. If this story of Washington's strategic genius resonates with you, I want to ask you to do 2 things. First, subscribe to Unbroken Regiment so you never miss the stories of the men and women whose courage changed history, but whose names were nearly lost to time. Second, turn on the notification bell right now, because the next video might be the story of a hero you have been looking for. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.